McCandless, I came to believe with increasing conviction, scrupulously steered clear of the reportedly toxic H. McKenzie and never ate its seeds or any other part of the plant. He was indeed poisoned, but the plant that killed him wasn't wild sweet pea. The agent of his demise was wild potato, H. alpinum, the species plainly identified as non-toxic in Taenina plant lore. The book advises only that the roots of the wild potato are edible. Although it says nothing about the seeds of the species being edible, it also says nothing about the seeds being toxic. Nor have the seeds of H. alpinum ever been described as toxic in any other published text. But the pea family, Leguminosae, to which H. alpinum belongs, happens to be rife with species that produce alkaloids, chemical compounds that have powerful pharmacological effects on humans and animals. Morphine, caffeine, nicotine, curare, strychnine, and mescaline are all alkaloids. And in many alkaloid-producing species, moreover, the toxin is strictly localized within the plant. What happens with a lot of legumes, explains John Bryant, a chemical ecologist at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, is that the plants concentrate alkaloids in the seed coats in late summer to discourage animals from eating their seeds. Depending on the time of year, it would not be uncommon for a plant with edible roots to have poisonous seeds. If a species does produce alkaloids as fall approaches, the seeds are where the toxin is most likely to be found. During my visit to the Shoshana River in 1993, I collected samples of H. alpinum growing within a few feet of the bus and sent some dried seed pods from this sample to Dr. Thomas Clausen, a colleague of Professor Bryant's in the chemistry department at the University of Alaska. Although preliminary analysis by Clausen and a graduate student, Edward Treadwell, indicated the seeds contained traces of an alkaloid, subsequent, more thorough testing turned up no indication of any alkaloids whatsoever, toxic or otherwise. I was baffled. Given the alarming, unambiguous entry McCandless had scrawled in his journal on July 30th, I found it hard to believe that the enormous quantity of seeds he'd eaten just prior to that date played no role in his death. Long after the first edition of this book was published in 1996, I continued to puzzle over the absence of alkaloids in the seeds tested by Clausen and Treadwell. Over a period of several years, I doggedly sifted through the scientific literature, hoping to find a clue that would explain this conundrum. One afternoon, I came across an article titled Identification of Swainsonine as a Probable Contributory Mycotoxin in Moldy Forage Mycotoxicosis. The article described a fungus, Rhizoctonia leguminicola, which commonly grows on many of the species of legumes during the summer months in soggy climates. And R. leguminicola, it turns out, is a variety of mold that produces a potent alkaloid called swainsonine, a compound well known to ranchers and veterinarians as a killer of livestock. The literature of veterinary medicine is rife with cases of animals stricken by swainsonine poisoning after eating damp forage contaminated with R. leguminicola. Upon reading further about the connection between R. leguminicola and swainsonine, I had an epiphany. It wasn't the seeds of the wild potato that had done McCandless in. He was probably killed instead by mold that had been growing on those seeds. The dried seeds that I'd sent Clausen and Treadwell had tested negative because they weren't moldy. But there was ample reason to suspect that the seeds on which McCandless dined during the last 2 weeks of July may have been contaminated with R. leguminicola. He had begun to gather and eat large quantities of wild potato seeds on July 14th, during an extended period of rainy weather. Between meals, he stored these green seed pods in damp, unclean Ziploc bags, an excellent culture for the proliferation of mold. If the wild potato seeds McCandless ate were contaminated with swainsonine from an eruption of R. leguminicola, it means the guy wasn't quite as reckless or incompetent as he had been made out to be. It means he didn't carelessly confuse one species with another, The plant that poisoned him wasn't toxic per se. McCandless simply had the misfortune to eat moldy seeds. An innocent mistake, it was nevertheless sufficient to end his life. The literature of veterinary medicine does not lack for cases of animals felled by Swainsonine poisoning after grazing on forage contaminated with R. leguminicola. The most obvious symptoms of Swainsonine poisoning are neurological. According to a paper published in the Journal of the American Veterinary Medicine Association, livestock that have ingested Swainsonine show signs of depression, a slow staggering gait, rough coat, dull eyes with a staring look, emaciation, muscular incoordination, and nervousness, especially when stressed. In addition, affected animals may become solitary and hard to handle, and may have difficulty eating and drinking. The effects of Swainsonine poisoning are chronic. The alkaloid rarely kills outright. The toxin does the deed insidiously, indirectly, by inhibiting an enzyme essential to glycoprotein metabolism. It creates a massive vapor lock, as it were, in mammalian fuel lines. The body is prevented from turning what it eats into a source of usable energy. If you ingest too much Swainsonine, you are bound to starve, no matter how much food you put into your stomach. Animals will sometimes recover from Swainsonine poisoning after they stop eating contaminated forage, but only if they're in fairly robust condition to begin with. In order for the toxic compound to be excreted in the urine, it first has to bind with available molecules of glucose or amino acid. A large store of proteins and sugars must be present to mop up the poison and wring it from the body. The problem, says Professor Bryant, is that if you're lean and hungry to begin with, you're obviously not going to have any glucose and protein to spare, so there's no way to flush the toxin from your system. When a starving mammal ingests an alkaloid, even one as benign as coffee, it's going to get hit much harder by it than it normally would because they lack the glucose reserves necessary to excrete the stuff. The alkaloid is simply going to accumulate in the system. If McCandless ate a big slug of those seeds while he was already in a semi-starving condition, it would have been a setup for catastrophe. Laid low by the moldy seeds, McCandless discovered that he was suddenly far too weak to hike out and save himself. He was now too weak even to hunt effectively, and thus grew weaker still, sliding closer and closer toward starvation. His life was spiraling toward the brink with awful speed. There are no journal entries for July 31st or August 1st. On August 2nd, the diary says only terrible wind. Autumn was just around the corner. The temperature was dropping, and the days were becoming noticeably shorter. Each rotation of the earth held 7 fewer minutes of daylight and 7 more of cold and darkness. In the span of a single week, the night grew nearly an hour longer. Day 100, made it, he noted jubilantly on August 5th, proud of achieving such a significant milestone. But in weakest condition of life, death looms as serious threat, too weak to walk out, have literally become trapped in the wild. No game. If McCandless had possessed a U.S. Geological Survey topographical map, it would have alerted him to the existence of a Park Service cabin on the upper Shoshana River, 6 miles due south of the bus, a distance he might have been able to cover even in a severely weakened state. The cabin, just inside the boundary of Denali National Park, had been stocked with a small amount of emergency food, bedding, and first aid supplies for the use of backcountry rangers on their winter patrols. And although they aren't marked on the map, 2 miles even closer to the bus are a pair of private cabins, one owned by the well-known Healy dog mushers Will and Linda Forsberg, the other by an employee of Denali National Park, Steve Carwile, where there should have been some food as well. McCandless's apparent salvation, in other words, seemed to be only a 3-hour walk upriver. This sad irony was widely noted in the aftermath of his death. But even if he had known about these cabins, they wouldn't have delivered McCandless from harm. At some point after mid April, when the last of the cabins was vacated as the spring thaw made dog mushing and snow machine travel problematic, somebody broke into all three cabins and vandalized them extensively. The food inside was exposed to animals and the weather, ruining it. The damage wasn't discovered until late July, when a wildlife biologist named Paul Atkinson made the grueling 10-mile bushwhack over the outer range, from the road into Denali National Park to the Park Service shelter. He was shocked and baffled by the mindless destruction that greeted him. It was obviously not the work of a bear, Atkinson reports. I'm a bear technician, so I know what bear damage looks like. This looked like somebody had gone at the cabins with a claw hammer and bashed everything in sight. From the size of the fireweed growing up through the mattresses that had been tossed outside, it was clear that the vandalism had occurred many weeks earlier. It was completely trashed, Will Forsberg says of his cabin. Everything that wasn't nailed down had been wrecked. All the lamps were broken and most of the windows. The bedding and mattresses had been pulled outside and thrown in a heap. Ceiling boards yanked down. Fuel cans were punctured. The wood stove was removed. Even a big carpet had been hauled out to rot. And all the food was gone. So the cabins wouldn't have helped Alex much even if he had found them. Or then again, maybe he did. Forsberg considers McCandless the prime suspect. He believes that McCandless blundered upon the cabins after arriving at the bus during the first week of May, flew into a rage over the intrusion of civilization on his precious wilderness experience, and systematically wrecked the buildings. This theory fails to explain, however, why McCandless didn't then also trash the bus. Carwile also suspects McCandless. It's just intuition, he explains, but I get the feeling he was the kind of guy who might want to set the wilderness free. Destroying the cabins would be a way of doing that. Or maybe it was his intense dislike of the government. He saw the sign on the Park Service cabin, identifying it as such, assumed all three cabins were government property, and decided to strike a blow against Big Brother. That certainly seems within the realm of possibility. The authorities, for their part, don't think McCandless was the vandal. We really hit a blank on who might have done it, says Ken Carer, chief ranger for Denali National Park. But Chris McCandless isn't considered a suspect by the National Park Service. In fact, there's nothing in McCandless's journal or photographs to suggest he went anywhere near the cabins. When McCandless ventured beyond the bus in early May, his pictures show that he headed north, downstream along the Shoshana, the opposite direction of the cabins. And even if he had somehow chanced upon them, it's difficult to imagine him destroying the buildings without boasting of the deed in his diary. There are no entries in McCandless's journal for August 6th, 7th, and 8th. On August 9th, he notes that he shot at a bear but missed. On August 10th, he saw a caribou but didn't get a shot off, and he killed 5 squirrels. If a sufficient amount of swainsonine had accumulated in his body, however, this windfall of small game would have provided little nourishment. On August 11th, he killed and ate 1 ptarmigan. On August 12th, he dragged himself out of the bus to forage for berries, after posting a plea for assistance in the unlikely event that someone would stop by while he was away. Written in meticulous block letters on a page torn from Gogol's Taras Bulba, it reads, SOS, I need your help. I am injured near death and too weak to hike out of here. I am all alone. This is no joke. In the name of God, please remain to save me. I am out collecting berries close by and shall return this evening. Thank you. He signed the note, Chris McCandless, August? Recognizing the gravity of his predicament, he had abandoned the cocky moniker he'd been using for years, Alexander Supertramp, in favor of the name given to him at birth by his parents. Many Alaskans have wondered why, in his depression, McCandless didn't start a forest fire at this point. As a distress signal. There were nearly 2 full gallons of stove gas in the bus. Presumably, it would have been a simple matter to start a conflagration large enough to attract the attention of passing airplanes, or at least burn a giant SOS into the muskeg. Contrary to common belief, however, the bus doesn't lie beneath any established flight path, and very few planes fly over it. Over the 4 days I spent on the Stampede Trail, I didn't see a single aircraft overhead, other than commercial jets flying at altitudes greater than 25,000 feet. Small planes did, no doubt, pass within the sight of the bus from time to time, but McCandless would probably have had to start a fairly large forest fire to be sure of attracting their attention. And as Corrine McCandless points out, Chris would never, ever intentionally burn down a forest, not even to save his life. Anybody who would suggest otherwise doesn't understand the first thing about my brother. Starvation is not a pleasant way to expire. In the advanced stages of famine, as the body begins to consume itself, the victim suffers muscle pain, heart disturbances, loss of hair, dizziness, shortness of breath, extreme sensitivity to cold, physical and mental exhaustion. The skin becomes discolored. In the absence of key nutrients, a severe chemical imbalance develops in the brain, inducing convulsions and hallucinations. Some people who have been brought back from the far edge of starvation, though, report that near the end the hunger vanishes, the terrible pain dissolves, and the suffering is replaced by a sublime euphoria, a sense of calm accompanied by transcendent mental clarity. It would be nice to think McCandless experienced a similar rapture. On August 12th, he wrote what would prove to be the final words in his journal, Beautiful Blueberries. From August 13th through 18th, his journal records nothing beyond a tally of the days. At some point during this week, he tore the final page from Louis L'Amour's memoir, Education of a Wandering Man. On one side of the page were some lines L'Amour had quoted from Robinson Jeffers' poem, Wise Men in Their Bad Hours. Death's a fierce meadowlark, but to die having made something more equal to the centuries than muscle and bone is mostly to shed weakness. The mountains are dead stone. The people admire or hate their stature, their insolent quietness. The mountains are not softened or troubled, and a few dead men's thoughts have the same temper. On the other side of the page, which was blank, McCandless penned a brief adios. I have had a happy life, and thank the Lord. Goodbye, and may God bless all. Then he crawled into the sleeping bag his mother had sewn for him and slipped into unconsciousness. He probably died on August 18th, 112 days after he'd walked into the wild, 19 days before 6 Alaskans would happen across the bus and discover his body inside. One of his last acts was to take a picture of himself, standing near the bus under the high Alaska sky, one hand holding his final note toward the camera lens, the other raised in a brief, beatific farewell. His face is horribly emaciated, almost skeletal, but if he pitied himself in those last difficult hours, because he was so young, because he was alone, because his body had betrayed him and his will had let him down, it's not apparent from the photograph. He is smiling in the picture, and there is no mistaking the look in his eyes. Chris McCandless was at peace, serene as a monk gone to God.